Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. It's really been amazing because we started just 2 years ago with the three of us in our Wade office. And now here we are, the three of us in our basement at home. So, wow, what a journey. What a ride we've been on.
Are you saying that that's a trajectory down, David?
Well, that reminds me.
We're at least holding steady. We're holding steady.
Welcome to the Wade podcast as we move into the season where we celebrate the gift of God's incarnation, born as a babe in the manger. And we wanted to think about the various gifts that we have experienced through the year. And we're going to look back on some of our former podcasts and explain why we enjoy them. But before we do that, we just want to thank you, the listeners, for being gifts to us. We are so excited about the fact that we have people who are turning into this podcast from 70 different countries. And it reminded me how we are together as a great cloud of witnesses to the importance of Christ and his involvement in our lives, and how the 7 authors at the Wade help us think through the significance of that, but also ignite our imaginations to present that significance in new ways.
Yeah.
And if you have joined this great cloud of witnesses, and think of this, when you're listening to a podcast, you are being joined by people from India and Honduras and Guatemala and Yemen and United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
And California.
And even California, that's right. To celebrate what we all hold dear, ultimately Jesus Christ, and how these authors at the Wade provide new insight about them, especially via our imaginations. So if you have really enjoyed our podcast this year, feel that you've benefited from them, we would like you to think of how you might provide a gift for us. The Wade is entirely self-funded. Everything we do, we have to raise our own money for. So if you want us to keep providing good podcasts, you might consider putting us in your end of the year giving plan. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's just get started with the gifts of this past year. So David, what was your favorite podcast this year and why?
Well, we've had a lot of great podcasts. We really enjoyed doing the podcast. It's fun to get together and just have great stimulating conversations and realize that others can eavesdrop a little bit and join those conversations. Sometimes I wish we had a call-in line so that people could give us live feedback as we're talking. For me, the highlight of the year, the gift of the year, would be taking these lost Lewis tapes, his readings of Paralandra and That Hideous Strength, and even his recitation of the prologue from Canterbury Tales. To hear his voice and to imagine this room at the kilns with the teacups tinkling and the fly buzzing in the room, and then to be able to present them to a wider audience and discuss the context. To me, that was a real highlight for this year.
Yeah, definitely. I remember, David, when you came by my desk at the Wade with the thumb drive and you said, "Hey, I have something to share with you. It's top secret."
Right.
And it took us a while to figure out how we're going to get those out. And part of the way that we were able to make them available to people was Andrew Peterson and his brother Pete Peterson with the Rabbit Room. For me, that was one of the highlights of the year, because back when we started the podcast 2 years ago, I guess now, December 2018, we were talking about potential guests and people we'd like to have on the show. And Andrew was one of the people that we wanted to have because, as we talked about in his episode, he's doing the kind of stuff through the Rabbit Room that our authors are doing, and drawing in people and drawing attention to them. And so that was just exciting to be able to interview him. And that was one of those weird opportunities that was made possible kind of because of COVID.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So, but that was exciting to be able to interview him and then be able to work with his brother to get the Lost Lewis tapes out to everybody through the Rabbit Room. So that was.
We thank you for all the work you did on that, Aaron. That was really a lot of work to.
Well, that
fix
is
the
one of
master
the
files.
gifts that we recognize is what a great job Aaron does with these productions. He makes us sound much more intelligent than we are because he edits out all our pauses and ums and misspoken words, although we've still inevitably had errors because we're just spontaneously talking, even though we always reread the books and do research before our podcasts.
Yeah.
But the spontaneity is one of the pleasures, one of the gifts for us of these podcasts.
It's really been amazing because we started just 2 years ago with the three of us in our Wade office. And now here we are, the three of us in our basement at home. So, wow, what a journey. What a ride we've been on.
Are you saying that that's a trajectory down, David?
Well, that reminds me.
We're at least holding steady. We're holding steady.
It reminds me of one of my favorite podcasts, and that was about George McDonald, primarily because I was so excited to have had the opportunity to read more of him. I had the experience, and I talk about this in the podcast, where a lot of people who visit the Wade say, we just don't enjoy Phantastes and Lilith. They're too bizarre. I felt the exact same way. But they almost whispered it like, I feel I have this guilty admission to make because, of course, McDonald is so important to C.S. Lewis because Phantastes baptized Lewis's imagination. So in light of the fact we were doing a podcast, I read some of the Scottish novels and just fell in love with MacDonald's prose style for his adult novels. And so that made me realize, okay, MacDonald's about much more than his fantasy or his fairy tales for children.
Yeah.
So that was actually a gift for me. And I'm now reading through Robert Falconer. I had talked about Alec Forbes of Haugelin in our podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that episode was back in early September. We did that one, Surprised by George.
Yes.
By George.
And we actually had some really good feedback from some George McDonald scholars on that episode.
That's right.
So that's another thing that's always exciting and enjoyable is to hear from scholars and professionals and people around the country that enjoy our episodes. Suzanne Bray reached out to us about an episode we did this summer with Diana Glyer, and so it's always exciting to hear back from people and especially other people that are practicing or have been guests on the podcast and stuff like that.
Right.
I think one of our omissions from that George McDonald podcast, we didn't mention our good friend Roland Hine and all his wonderful work on George McDonald. That was a real oversight for that episode.
Roland Hine has been so important to the Wade. Talk about a gift. He is a gift that we need to acknowledge. He's done great scholarship on George McDonald and for years has led Saturday morning discussions for adults in the area. And of course, COVID has turned those into online texting about
Well, he's doing that now. Yeah, he's posing questions online, and his book club are able to type in answers. So they still have some community going there, even in these quarantine times.
Well, and that is one of the gifts that we see from many of these podcasts is community. So this community that Roland Hine has established around himself is comparable to the community of the Inklings. And people who listen to these podcasts, I'm sure, have heard of the Inklings, and we've had some wonderful podcasts about the issue of community. We talked to Diana Glyer, whose
really
book, The Company We Keep, was quite groundbreaking, showing that even though the Inklings wanted to deny that they influenced each other, that they inevitably did.
Yeah. I remember when I first came to the Wade and I was talking about a potential influence between two of our authors, and somebody informed me that no, they didn't inform each other at all. And I was like, what? That makes no sense. They hung out every week and talked about the stuff they were writing, and they didn't influence each other? That seems so strange.
Well, they themselves said that. That's what threw everybody off.
Right.
Yeah.
We're used to taking their word for it.
Yeah.
But see, that explains the gift of the podcasts that look at the cultural contexts in which our authors are writing.
Yeah.
We had one particular, the first podcast in May, we did something on modernism and T.S. Eliot and his relationship to C.S. Lewis, and I talked about G.K. Chesterton and a book I had recently reviewed. And modernism was just so emphatic about autonomy, that the art object must be autonomous, hence abstract expressionism.
Yeah.
It shouldn't relate to anything in the world. The artist should be autonomous and denies influences of other people.
Yeah.
And so that helps us understand their denial of influence, because that was part of the discursive practices of the time. And you always need to recognize cultural context to understand what someone is saying.
Yeah.
And of course, this is one of the emphases of postmodernism, challenging the very idea that we're autonomous. And of course, for us as Christians, we all recognize, no, we aren't autonomous.
Yeah.
We are in a world that has been created by a God who wants to be in relationship with us.
Yeah, definitely. We had a number of episodes that dealt with that sort of context and background. You mentioned the one with T.S. Eliot and modernism, but then we also talked about Romanticism and mysticism. David, I really liked what you had to talk about in the Romanticism episode. That was really good to hear sort of Lewis's definition of Romanticism and how that informed his faith journey.
Well, I remembered he gives 7 definitions of Romanticism, and then he says, none of those are what I had in mind. So that's always nice. When it came to community, I was thinking of learning through studying for the podcast that McDonald was friends with Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, but he's also friends with Mark Twain.
Right.
What an interesting literary community that would be.
Well, and Romanticism itself not only provides cultural context, because our authors, almost all, were fascinated by Romanticism, and Romanticism emphasizes community as well.
Yeah.
The German Romantics were in community, and the British Romantics were definitely in community. They hung out together the way the Inklings hung out together.
You know, fun fact, I was looking through C.S. Lewis's copy of Religious Essays by Rudolph Otto the other day at the Wade Center, and Lewis draws a line in the margin next to this very long paragraph describing this group of Romantic authors that were meeting in Jena, in Germany, and how they were exchanging these things. And it was clear that idea of writers and theologians talking and discussing community resonated with him, because he draws this line all the way down the length of the page. And Otto is one of his favorite authors. And so that was fascinating to me to see him see the value of those Romantic authors and them gathering and discussing these ideas.
It's so evocative to look at his books. I mean, the notes are great. Like when somebody said, well, it's a matter of rational philosophy, not mysticism. And Lewis writes, this man is a fool. Mysticism is well-based as a tradition of experiencing God. But the one where he just leaves a line or a bracket, you go, what got his attention?
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
It really makes you think.
Yeah. When you start seeing enough of those, you can see trends and stuff. But it's fascinating to see his books. David, I really liked the episode we did on mysticism, because we got to talk about one of your books, Into the Region of Law.
Right.
And sort of how Lewis was interested in mysticism, and how that influenced his thinking and stuff like that. That was a very interesting podcast.
Well, we just talked about Diana Glyer. She was kind of writing against the grain, because the established wisdom was that they were all rugged individualists. They didn't influence each other.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Tolkien's writing letters to people saying, I think Lewis plagiarized me about the trees attack. So how can you not influence each other if you're plagiarizing each other? But I also felt the same way. I was going against the grain, because people think of Lewis the logician.
Yeah.
And the idea that he was so interested in mysticism and numinous experiences and the direct experience of God, that was the side of him that I think a lot of people haven't seen.
Well, that important fact that surprises people when Lewis, not long before his death, was asked to name the greatest influences on his spiritual life, named 2 specialists in mysticism.
Right.
As well as, of course, Dorothy Sayers.
Oh, there
Yay!
you go. There you
Have
go.
to get in Dorothy Sayers.
Okay.
And GK.
First person to call in from the audience will get a free copy of Dorothy's. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have call-ins.
And G.K. Chesterton. But I forget if we talked about this in our podcast, that you got so much resistance to publishing that book, David. And once it was published, because people didn't want to believe that the great logician C.S. Lewis was influenced by mysticism. And here's all this evidence, but people see what they want to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was true, especially in Protestant circles. I had Anglicans and Roman Catholics write me very enthusiastic letters.
Right.
Protestants don't tend to like it when you name somebody Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross. If you're of somewhere, that doesn't sound like our kind of spirituality, Yeah, but that was really a worthwhile project. We did mysticism, romanticism, modernism. Stay tuned. We'll do classicism, Gnosticism, rheumatism. We'll get to all of them eventually.
Well, actually, I could do something someday on Gnosticism and
that's been a theme
Dorothy Sayers.
I was going to say that's been a theme, a sort of underlying theme in a lot of the podcasts. That's one of the things I think that makes our authors timeless is that they speak to a lot of these theological mistakes or reoccurring problems that people have in society, whether it's in a lot of the episodes we talk about, Lewis, it's disillusionment and sort of losing a sense of enchantment about the world. But then also like with Sayers and Chesterton, we've talked about their sort of focus on the incarnation, McDonald as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely a theme, but that's also something I've seen throughout the years, the timelessness of our authors,
right,
especially
right.
the COVID episode that we did right before the lockdown. I mean, it was like days before the lockdown
it was.
happened.
That's when we were still in our office. It was the last podcast we did in our office, and then we had to shut the Wade.
Yeah, but people really responded to that because, that was a scary time. Well, it's still scary, but it was definitely a scary time because everything was new and unknown, and there was so much we didn't know. And so it was really good to hear you guys talking with Jerry and sort of talking about how our Wade authors would have responded to COVID-19. That was a good episode. I've gone back and listened to that myself at times when sort of questioning
I almost
things.
wish we could, we might do a COVID too, because we talk so much about facing your mortality and thinking as a modern person, there's medicine or there's therapy or there's treatments, but we all have to realize. But we could have gone into a lot of other aspects of the quarantine, especially loneliness and social isolation.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, we're talking about Gnosticism, these three disembodied voices going out over the airwaves going, you've got to be embodied, you've got to be...
But we talked about community earlier. It's interesting that in the midst of this lockdown and social isolation that people have really been craving community.
Right.
And there's obviously something in our authors and in the example of their lives that has resonated and continues to resonate with people that makes them want to gather in community.
Well, that relates back to my opening comments about the great cloud of witnesses that we have through the podcast generated a type of community virtually.
Yeah.
But by having people listening from all over the world, we are reminded of the Church Universal.
Yeah.
That Jesus is true, not just for Western culture or Northern culture or developing culture. Jesus is true for all of humanity.
Yeah, definitely. We've had, for those of you guys who don't happen to live here, but might be interested, we've had a huge surge in listeners in India. India is now our number 2 demographic behind the United States.
That is so exciting.
They've jumped ahead of Canada. And so if you're listening to us from India, thank you for listening.
Yes, you're a gift.
Yeah, but it's exciting. And then we've even had some people reach out and ask if we could translate the podcast and even some of the transcripts for other foreign languages, listeners in South America and things like that. And so it's just really exciting and encouraging to hear people getting value and joining in these discussions that we've been having and gaining from our authors.
And David,
I would have to say, I've never been that impressed with the spirituality of Canadians. So, the fact that they've been bounced out of number 2, to me, that should be a concern for listeners.
Canada, you've got to step up your game if you want to compete with India.
Yeah.
Well, David, you were joking about Gnosticism in terms of the podcast. But in a way, it's much less Gnostic than sitting isolated and reading a book, insofar as people hear our embodied voices. They hear us interacting. They hear us interrupting each other. They hear us laughing.
Yeah.
I mean, that is about embodiment.
Yeah.
Whereas when you read a book, I can find something amusing in a book, but I rarely laugh out loud.
Yeah. Crystal, can you just explain what is Gnosticism?
Gnosticism, I love how Dorothy Sayers defines it. She calls it knowledge with a capital K. Insofar as it's all about the knowledge you gain of religious insight. And this was something that influenced several early heresies in the church, where embodiment was bad. Embodiment distracts from actual truth.
Yeah.
And of course, that runs counter to the whole point of the New Testament, where God took on flesh. God endorses the importance of embodiment.
Yeah.
God came to earth in the form of a baby. I mean, that is outrageous to think of, but we're just so used to it. We don't remember how radical that idea is, and why people of other religions actually denounced the idea. They said no transcendent God would ever deign to take on flesh.
Yeah.
And so they would advocate a more Gnostic. It's all about the knowledge you learn, and God is distant. God doesn't want to be in relationship with us.
That reminds me of a quote that Tim Keller uses when he talks about the incarnation, and when he talks about Jesus' vulnerability of him as a baby, and he says that God became killable.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's
Right?
a good way to put it. Right.
This idea that Jesus, God the Son, is just this small, vulnerable little child, and as we move into the Christmas season, is something to think about. But that was also as exciting this year, is that we got to talk to Kathy Keller.
Right.
Tim's wife, right before he found out about his cancer diagnosis. And we were able to talk about the letters that C.S. Lewis wrote to her when she was a young girl. And
that are hanging on her wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, how exciting. But she still has those letters handwritten from C.S.
Well,
Lewis.
we do have the advantage that this COVID quarantine came along in times of virtual technology, because our original idea was when people came to the Wade Center, we would sit them down and have a great discussion with them about their research.
Yeah.
And a lot of our early podcasts were physical conversations. But I think, Aaron, you discovered that we could do virtual conversations via Zoom and get the sound quality. So we've had Kathy Keller, Diana Glyer, Andrew Peterson. Some of our best podcast conversations have been through virtual technology rather than having to be all in the same room in the same place.
Yeah, it's opened up opportunities for us to reach out to people and talk to them, even if they're not at the Wade Center. But it's also forced us to rethink how we do our podcast, because it used to be that it was, us talking with Michael Ward or Malcolm Geit when they came to the Wade Center, and those were great. And I mean, we love those podcasts, but it has forced us to think about, well, how can we do a podcast with just David and Crystal and me over in the corner going,
Oh, wow. You're good at the oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
I notice when I listen, I'm good at just going, right. So, David, is that correct? Right.
Well, in a way, it's been more work since COVID shut things down, because our early podcasts, I wouldn't do any research in advance because I just relied on the guest who was in our office to explain his or her research and the exciting discoveries he or she is making. Whereas now, when it's the three of us, we know, we're going to do something on That Hideous Strength. And I have to go back and reread That Hideous Strength and Paralandra and Out of the Silent Planet, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
So part of my job has been the opportunity to refresh my sense of the brilliance of various works.
But I think people tune into the podcast because they want to hear you guys as experts. And I think that's one of the things we've been able to highlight this past year. So at the beginning of the year, Crystal, you started us off by giving us a discussion about your inaugural lecture at the Wade Center about salvation from cinema. And that was actually, people really responded to that. And then David, your inaugural lecture comparing Lewis and Tolkien and dragons and angels. And so I think people have really responded to you guys talking and sharing your own expertise and the books that you've written. We recently, just last week, we had an episode where you talked about your new book, Crystal. It's Subversive on Dorothy Sayers. So
it's off to a good start. Crystal's doing an interview tonight with the C.S. Lewis Society of California about the book.
Oh, wow.
And it got a starred review from Publishers Weekly.
Oh, okay.
So we're both excited and encouraged about the reception of that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, to have a secular journal like Publishers Weekly endorse its quality is quite satisfying. But it's all Sayers. I mean, she's just so interesting that how could it not be a good book?
We've had a number of good episodes about Sayers this year, with the Down to the Wireless episode and the Murder at the Wade. talking about their detective fiction. People really liked your setup for the murder in the basement, the way David.
Well, another fun thing about a podcast is you don't have to be as formal as an academic conference.
Yeah.
Where normally I'm doing a paper on Tolkien, you're doing a paper on Lewis, she's doing a paper on Sayers. It's fun to do these comparative studies. Sayers is detective novelist, Chesterton is detective novelist.
Yeah.
Lewis is a fantasy writer, Tolkien is a fantasy writer. When we heard from Pavel in Czechia, a big issue there was how they responded to Tolkien differently from how they responded to Lewis.
I liked some of the episodes we're able to compare and contrast our authors and their different approaches. I liked listening to your inaugural lecture where you're talking about the ways that Lewis and Tolkien used imagination and creativity in their books. That was a good podcast.
Well, I enjoy talking about it in my class. Every time you say something, you're discussing Tolkien and somebody says, isn't this like Lewis? Isn't this like Narnia?
Oh,
You're discussing Lewis and they say, this is a little bit like The Hobbit, isn't it? It's like Lennon and McCartney. It's very hard to discuss one or the other without the other name coming up, So yeah, they're kind of a natural pairing. And so we've enjoyed doing all these comparative conversations on the podcast here.
Another recent, we did the Lewis tapes, but we got to talk about the Ransom trilogy. It gave us an excuse to talk about the Ransom trilogy. And so that was a new format. And so I was just going to throw it out to anybody in the audience. If there are works or books by our authors that you guys would like us to talk about, David, you're an expert on, Chronicles of Narnia. Crystal, Sayers' books backwards and forwards. I think people don't give her enough credit for her detective fiction. So I don't know if you guys are interested in us talking more about some of the books of our authors. That might be something you can reach out and let us know. We'd like to hear.
Eventually, we've got to dive in and do Till We Have Faces, just a whole episode on that novel.
There's so many people who just love that novel, say it's their favorite Lewis novel.
And other people who don't get it. It has very mixed responses.
Right. It's like, I'm there too. So it would be good to have a conversation, and maybe I'll be won over the way I was won over by George McDonald.
Do you ever have podcasts that are debates? It's one of his finest novels of the 20th century. Are you kidding? He was having a bad day. We could have a...
we kind of felt that way. We had some mixed feelings about That Hideous Strength going into the episode.
That's true.
But
that's true.
Rereading it helped me gain some appreciation for it. So maybe that will help people with Till We Have Faces. Because I was the same way. I remember people saying, oh, you got to read this. As I had read everything else that Lewis had wrote. And so I sat down to read it and I was like, what in the world is going on?
Well, we talked about that happened to me with Fantasties and Lilith. I had so many people that said they loved it. It was their favorite thing, not just Lewis, but other people. I started reading them and I go, did I drink too much NyQuil before I started reading this? Why is this not? So sometime we're going to have to get a really serious McDonald scholar in here to interview and talk about what we're missing.
They are kind of like a NyQuil dream.
Did that book just turn into a butterfly? What's going on?
Exactly.
Where'd these worms come from?
Right. Well, David and I were actually thinking of starting the new year by conversing in 7 different sessions about each one of the Narnia Chronicles, because we know them as children's literature and we all know them as great apologetics, Christian truths embedded in his narratives. But there is a lot of literary stuff going on in the Chronicles of Narnia, so that the more educated you are, the more you can see. And that would be kind of fun to explore all those literary allusions. Like the one I think of immediately is allusions to Chaucer in one of the Chronicles.
Yeah, the Parliament of Owls is obviously a take on the Parliament of Fowls.
Did you guys know that has become a thing in pop culture through Batman?
What's that?
In the Batman comic series, they have developed this new thing called the Parliament or the Court of Owls. And they're these like bad guys that are pulling the strings behind the scenes in Gotham. And it's going to be in the new Batman movie. And I was like, wait a second, isn't that from the Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is. So who knows? It's a strange world.
Oh, first I heard.
Who knew that C.S. Lewis would be influencing Batman?
Well, part of the fun of reading Narnia is if you know his other books, like when you meet in the Silver Chair, once again, you meet Puddleglum.
Yeah.
And you remember that in his history of English literature, 16th century, excluding drama, he's talking about this untalented Scottish poet And when the poet talks about the river Styx, was supposed to be this great river of fire separating earth from Hades. And the poet says, it was such a puddle glum. And Lewis is very amused by that phrasing. And then 2 years later, you're reading The Silver Chair, and the character's name is Puddleglum.
Yeah.
So these things that seem like innocent children's stories, they're very layered and nuanced in terms of Lewis's.
I have lots of questions. Like, why is Santa Claus in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
I have an answer to that question. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, we'll come back to that.
This just reinforces that we need to do a series on each of the Narnia Chronicles.
Well, you know what? I'm just going to put this out there. Once again, if you guys have questions about the Chronicles of Narnia series, send us messages, reach out to us. You guys know how to get in touch with us, or you can send us an email at wade@wheaton.edu. And we'd like to hear your questions about the Chronicles of Narnia, and maybe we can talk about them in these upcoming episodes.
Yeah. And once again, if you are interested in helping support the Wade Center, just go to our website, Google Marion E. Wade Center, Wheaton, and you'll get our website. And there's just a little button you can just donate online. It would just really, really help encourage us in all the activities that
if things worked out, we could turn on the heat here in the basement. It'd be so much more comfortable.
We wouldn't have to wear our sweatshirts.
It did get a little cold last week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sitting here and doing a podcast in our mittens, you can see your breath in front of you and all that.
Well, I would like to thank you guys for letting me join you on all these episodes that we've done, first in your attic, and then when it got too hot in your basement. And now that it's too cold down here, maybe we'll have to move back up to the attic.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But I'm very grateful for this past year and the podcast, and to see us reach all these new people, particularly in new countries like we talked about in India, and you mentioned Yemen. We've had a fair amount of people listening to us from Yemen and Pakistan. And so it's just exciting to see God using our authors and what we've been able to do through the podcast to reach people. So I just thank you guys for letting me to join you in the basement.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Crystal.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.